Introduction Part 3. Special Situations. There are many paths that lead someone to this book. Perhaps you have more experience but have never done this sort of interview. Perhaps you're a tester or a PM. Or perhaps you're actually using this book to teach yourself how to interview better. Here's a little something for all these special situations. Experienced candidates. Some people assume that the algorithm-style questions you see in this book are only for recent grads. That's not entirely true. More experienced engineers might see slightly less focus on algorithm questions, but only slightly. If a company asks algorithm questions to inexperienced candidates, they tend to ask them to experienced candidates too. Rightly or wrongly, they feel that the skills demonstrated in these questions are important for all developers. Some interviewers might hold experienced candidates to a somewhat lower standard. After all, it's been years since these candidates took an algorithm class. They're out of practice. Others, though, hold experienced candidates to a higher standard, reasoning that the more years of experience allow a candidate to have seen many more types of problems. On average, it balances out. The exception to this rule is system design and architecture questions, as well as questions about your resume. Typically, students don't study much system architecture, so experience with such challenges would only come professionally. Your performance in such interview questions will be evaluated with respect to your experience level. However, students and recent graduates are still asked these questions and should be prepared to solve them as well as they can. Additionally, experienced candidates will be expected to give a more in-depth, impressive response to questions like, what was the hardest bug you faced? You have more experience, and your response to these questions should show it. Testers and SCETs. SCETs, software design engineers and tests, write code, but to test features instead of build features. As such, they have to be great coders and great testers. Double the prep work. If you're applying for an SCET role, take the following approach. Prepare the core testing problems. For example, how would you test a light bulb, a pen, a cash register, Microsoft Word? The testing chapter will give you more background on these problems. Practice the coding questions. The number one thing that SCETs get rejected for is coding skills. Although coding standards are typically lower for an SCET than for a traditional developer, SCETs are still expected to be very strong in coding and algorithms. Make sure that you practice solving all the same coding and algorithm questions that a regular developer would get. Practice testing the coding questions. A very popular format for SCET question is, write code to do X, followed by, okay, now test it. Even when the question doesn't specifically require this, you should ask yourself, how would I test this? Remember, any problem can be an SCET problem. Strong communication skills can also be very important for testers. Since your job requires you to work with so many different people, do not neglect the behavioral questions section. Career advice. Finally, a word of career advice. If, like many candidates, you're hoping to apply to an SCET position as the easy way into a company, be aware that many candidates find it very difficult to move from an SCET position to a dev position. Make sure to keep your coding and algorithm skills very sharp if you hope to make this move, and try to switch within 1 to 2 years. Otherwise, you might find it very difficult to be taken seriously in a dev interview. Never let your coding skills atrophy. Product and program management. These PM roles vary wildly across companies and even within a company. At Microsoft, for instance, some PMs may be essentially customer evangelists working in a customer-facing role that borders on marketing. Across campus, though, other PMs may spend much of their day coding. The latter type of PMs would likely be tested on coding, since this is an important part of their job function. Generally speaking, interviewers for PM positions are looking for candidates to demonstrate skills in the following areas. Handling ambiguity. This is typically not the most critical area for an interview, but you should be aware that interviewers do look for skill here. Interviewers want to see that when faced with an ambiguous situation, you don't get overwhelmed and stall. They want to see you tackle the problem head on, seeking new information, prioritizing the most important parts, and solving the problem in a structured way. This typically will not be tested directly, though it can be, but it may be one of many things an interviewer is looking for in a problem. Customer focus, attitude. Interviewers want to see that your attitude is customer focused. Do you assume that everyone will use the product just like you do? Or are you the type of person who puts himself in the customer's shoes and tries to understand how they want to use the product? Questions like, design an alarm clock for the blind, are ripe for examining this aspect. When you hear a question like this, be sure to ask a lot of questions to understand who the customer is and how they are using the product. The skills covered in the testing section are closely related to this. Customer focus, technical skills. Some teams with more complex products need to ensure that their PMs walk in with a strong understanding of the product, as it would be difficult to acquire this knowledge on the job. Deep technical knowledge of mobile phones is probably not necessary to work on the Android or Windows phone teams, although it might still be nice to have, whereas an understanding of security might be necessary to work on Windows security. Hopefully you wouldn't interview with a team that requires specific technical skills unless you at least claim to possess the required skills. Multi-level communication. PMs need to be able to communicate with people at all levels in the company, across many positions and ranges of technical skills. Your interviewer will want to see that you possess this flexibility in your communication. This is often examined directly through a question such as, explain TCP/IP to your grandmother. Your communication skills may also be assessed by how you discuss your prior projects. Passion for technology. Happy employees are productive employees, so a company wants to make sure that you'll enjoy the job and be excited about your work. And passion for technology, and ideally the company or team should come across in your answers. You may be asked a question directly like, why are you interested in Microsoft? Additionally, your interviewers will look for enthusiasm in how you discuss your prior experience and how you discuss the team's challenges. They want to see that you'll be eager to face the job's challenges. Teamwork/leadership. This may be the most important aspect of the interview, and, not surprisingly, the job itself. All interviewers will be looking for your ability to work well with other people. Most commonly, this is assessed with questions like, tell me about a time when a teammate wasn't pulling his/her own weight. Your interviewer is looking to see that you handle conflicts well, that you take initiative, that you understand people, and that people like working with you. Your work preparing for behavioral questions will be extremely important here. All of the above areas are important skills for PMs to master and are therefore key focus areas of the interview. The weighting of each of these areas will roughly match the importance that the area holds in the actual job. Dev lead and managers. Strong coding skills are almost always required for dev lead positions and often for management positions as well. If you'll be coding on the job, make sure to be very strong with coding and algorithms, just like a dev would be. Google, in particular, holds managers to high standards when it comes to coding. In addition, prepare to be examined for skills in the following areas. Teamwork/leadership. Anyone in a management-like role needs to be able to both lead and work with people. You will be examined implicitly and explicitly in these areas. Explicit evaluation will come in the form of asking you how you handled prior situations, such as when you disagreed with the manager. The implicit evaluation comes in the form of your interviewers watching how you interact with them. If you come off as too arrogant, too arrogant or too passive, your interviewer may feel you aren't great as a manager. Prioritization. Managers are often faced with tricky issues, such as how to make sure a team meets a tough deadline. Your interviewers will want to see that you can prioritize a project appropriately, cutting the less important aspects. Prioritization means asking the right questions to understand what is critical and what you can reasonably expect to accomplish. Communication. Managers need to communicate well. Managers need to communicate with people both above and below them, and potentially with customers and other much less technical people. Interviewers will look to see that you can communicate at many levels and that you can do so in a way that is friendly and engaging. This is, in some ways, an evaluation of your personality. Getting things done. Perhaps the most important thing that a manager can do is be a person who gets things done. This means striking the right balance between preparing for a project and actually implementing it. You need to understand how to structure a project and how to motivate people so you can accomplish the team's goals. Ultimately, most of these areas come back to your prior experience and your personality. Be sure to prepare very, very thoroughly using the interview preparation grid. Startups. The application and interview process for startups is highly variable. We can't go through every startup, but we can offer some general pointers. Understand, however, that the process at a specific startup might deviate from this. The application process. Many startups might post job listings, but for the hottest startups, often the best way in is through a personal referral. This reference doesn't necessarily need to be a close friend or a coworker. Often, just by reaching out and expressing your interest, you can get someone to pick up your resume to see if you're a good fit. Visas and work authorizations. Unfortunately, many smaller startups in the US are not able to sponsor work visas. They hate the system as much as you do, but you won't be able to convince them to hire you anyway. If you require a visa and wish to work with a startup, your best bet is to reach out to a professional recruiter who works with many startups and may have a better idea of which startups will work with visa issues, or to focus your search on bigger startups. Resume selection factors. Startups tend to want engineers who are not only smart and who can code, but also people who would work well in an entrepreneurial environment. Your resume should ideally show initiative. What sort of projects have you started? Being able to hit the ground running is also very important. They want people who already know the language of the company. The interview process. In contrast to big companies, which tend to look mostly at your general aptitude with respect to software development, startups often look closely at your personality fit, skill set, and prior experience. Personality fit. Personality fit is typically assessed by how you interact with your interviewer. Establishing a friendly, engaging conversation with your interviewers is your ticket to many job offers. Skill set. Because startups need people who can hit the ground running, they are likely to assess your skills with specific programming languages. If you know a language the startup works with, make sure to brush up on the details. Experience. Startups are likely to ask you a lot of questions about your experience. Pay special attention to the behavioral question section. In addition to the above areas, the coding and algorithms questions that you see in this book are also very common. Acquisitions and acquihires. During the technical due diligence process for many acquisitions, the acquirer will often interview most or all of the startup's employees. Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and many other companies have this as a standard part of many acquisitions. Which startups go through this and why? Part of the reasoning for this is that their employees had to go through this process to get hired. They don't want acquisitions to be an easy way into the company. And since the team is a core motivator for the acquisition, they figure it makes sense to assess the skills of the team. Not all acquisitions are like this, of course. The famous multi-billion-dollar acquisitions generally did not have to go through this process. Those acquisitions, after all, are usually about the user base and community, less so about the employees or even technology, assessing the team's skills is less essential. However, it is not as simple as acquihires get interviewed, traditional acquisitions do not. There is a big gray area between acquihires, i.e. talent acquisitions, and product acquisitions. Many startups are acquired for the team and ideas behind the technology. The acquirer might discontinue the product, but have the team work on something very similar. If your startup is going through this process, you can typically expect your team to have interviews very similar to what a normal candidate would experience, and therefore very similar to what you'll see in this book. How important are these interviews? These interviews can carry enormous importance. They have three different roles. They can make or break acquisitions. They are often the reason a company does not get acquired. They determine which employees receive offers to join the acquirer. They can affect the acquisition price, in part as a consequence of the number of employees who join. These interviews are much more than a mere screen. Which employees go through the interviews? For tech startups, usually all of the engineers go through the interview process, as they are one of the core motivators for the acquisition. In addition, sales, customer support, product managers, and essentially any other role might have to go through it. The CEO is often slotted into a product manager interview or dev manager interview, as this is often the closest match for the CEO's current responsibilities. This is not an absolute rule, though. It depends on what the CEO's role presently is and what the CEO is interested in. With some of my clients, the CEO has even opted to not interview and to leave the company upon the acquisition. What happens to employees who don't perform well in the interview? Employees who underperform will often not receive offers to join the acquirer. If many employees don't perform well, the acquisition will If many employees don't perform well, then the acquisition will likely not go through. In some cases, employees who perform poorly in interviews will get contract positions for the purpose of knowledge transfer. These are temporary positions with the expectation that the employee leaves at the termination of the contract, often 6 months, although sometimes the employee ends up being retained. In other cases, the poor performance was a result of the employee being misslotted. This occurs in two common situations. Sometimes a startup labels someone who is not a traditional software engineer as a software engineer. This often happens with data scientists or data engineers. These people may underperform during the software engineer interviews as their actual role involves other skills. In other cases, a CEO sells a junior software engineer as more senior than he actually is. He underperforms the senior bar because he's being held to an unfairly high standard. In our case, sometimes the employee will be re-interviewed for a more appropriate position. Other times, though, the employee is just out of luck. In rare cases, a CEO is able to override the decision for a particularly strong employee whose interview performance didn't reflect this. Your best and worst employees might surprise you. The problem-solving/algorithm interviews conducted at the top tech companies evaluate particular skills, which might not perfectly match what their manager evaluates in their employees. I've worked with many companies that are surprised at who their strongest and weakest performers are in interviews. That junior engineer who still has a lot to learn about personal development might turn out to be a great problem solver in these interviews. Don't count anyone out or in until you've evaluated them the same way your interviewers will. Are employees held to the same standards as typical candidates? Essentially, yes, although there's a bit more leeway. The big companies tend to take a risk-averse approach to hiring. If someone is on the fence, they often lean towards a no hire. In the case of an acquisition, the on-the-fence employees can be pulled through by strong performance from the rest of the team. How do employees tend to react to the news of an acquisition acquihire? This is a big concern for many startup CEOs and founders. Will the employees be upset about this process? Or what if we get their hopes up, but it doesn't happen? What I've seen with my clients is that the leadership is worried about this more than is necessary. Certainly, some employees are upset about the process. They might not be excited about joining one of the big companies for any number of reasons. Most employees, though, are cautiously optimistic about the process. They hope it goes through, but they know that the existence of these interviews means that it might not. What happens to the team after an acquisition? Every situation is different. However, most of my clients have been kept together as a team, possibly integrated into an existing team. How should you prepare your team for acquisition interviews? Interview prep for acquisition interviews is fairly similar to typical interviews at the Inquirer. The difference is that your company is doing this as a team and that each employee was individually selected for the interview on their own merits. You're all in this together. Some startups I've worked with put their quote-unquote real work on hold and have their teams spend the next 2 or 3 weeks on interview prep. Obviously, that's not a choice all companies can make, but from the perspective of wanting the acquisition to go through, that does increase your results substantially. Your team should study individually in teams of 2 or 3, or by doing mock interviews with each other. If possible, use all 3 of these approaches. Some people may be less prepared than others. Many developers at startups might have only vaguely heard of Big O Time, binary search tree, breadth first search, and other important concepts. They'll need some extra time to prepare. People without computer science degrees, or who earned their degrees a long time ago, should focus first on learning the core concepts discussed in this book, especially Big O Time, which is one of the most important. A good first exercise is to implement all the core data structures and algorithms from scratch. If the acquisition is important to your company, give these people the time they need to prepare. They'll need it. Don't wait until the last minute. As a startup, you might be used to taking things as they come without a ton of planning. Startups that do this with acquisition interviews tend not to fare well. Acquisition interviews often come up very suddenly. A company CEO is chatting with acquirer or several acquirers, and conversations get increasingly serious. The acquirer mentions the possibility of interviews at some point in the future, and all of a sudden, there is a come in at the end of this week message. If you wait until there is a firm date set for the interviews, you probably won't get much more than a couple of days to prepare. That might not be enough time for your engineers to learn core computer science concepts and practice interview questions. For interviewers, since writing the last edition, I've learned that a lot of interviewers are using cracking the coding interview to learn how to interview. That wasn't really the best intention, but I might as well offer some guidance for interviews. Don't actually ask the exact questions in here. First, these questions were selected because they're good for interview preparation. Some questions that are good for interview preparation are not always good for interviewing. For example, there are some brain teasers in this book because sometimes interviewers ask these sorts of questions. It's worthwhile for candidates to practice those if they're interviewing at a company that likes them, even though I personally find them to be bad questions. Second, your candidates are reading this book too. You don't want to ask questions that your candidates have already solved. You can ask questions similar to these, but don't just pluck questions out of here. Your goal is to test their problem-solving skills, not their memorization skills. Ask medium and hard problems. The goal of these questions is to evaluate someone's problem-solving skills. When you ask questions that are too easy, performance gets clustered together. Minor issues can substantially drop someone's performance. It's not a reliable indicator. Look for questions with multiple hurdles. Some questions have aha moments. They rest on a particular insight. If the candidate doesn't get that one bit, then they do poorly. If they get it, then suddenly they've outperformed many candidates. Even if that insight is an indicator of skills, it's still only one indicator. Ideally, you want a question that has a series of hurdles, insights, or optimizations. Multiple data points beat a single data point. Here's a test. If you can give a hint or a piece of guidance that makes a substantial difference in a candidate's performance, then it's probably not a good interview question. Use hard questions, not hard knowledge. Some interviewers, in an attempt to make a question hard, inadvertently make the knowledge hard. Sure enough, fewer candidates do well, so the statistics look right, but it's not for reasons that indicate much about the candidate's skills. The knowledge you're expecting candidates to have should be fairly straightforward data structures and algorithm knowledge. It's reasonable to expect a computer science graduate to understand the basics of Big O and trees. Most will remember Dijkstra's algorithm or the specifics of how ABL trees work. If your interview question expects obscure knowledge, ask yourself, is this truly an important skill? Is it so important that I would like to either reduce the number of candidates I hire or reduce the amount to which I focus on problem solving or other skills? Every new skill or attribute you reevaluate shrinks the number of offers extended, unless you counterbalance this by relaxing the requirements for a different skill. Sure, all else being equal, you might prefer someone who could recite the finer points of a 2-inch thick algorithms textbook, but all else isn't equal. Avoid scary questions. Some questions intimidate candidates because it seems like they involve some specialized knowledge, even if they really don't. This often includes questions that involve math or probability, low-level knowledge, reallocation, etc., system design or scalability, proprietary systems, Google Maps, etc. For example, one question I sometimes ask is to find all positive integer solutions under 1,000 to a cubed plus b cubed equals c cubed plus d cubed on page 68. Many candidates will at first think they have to do some sort of fancy factorization of this or simulate advanced math. They don't. They need to understand the concept of exponents, sums, and equality. That's it. When I ask this question, I explicitly say, I know this sounds like a math problem. Don't worry, it's not. It's an algorithm question. If they start going down the path of factorization, I stop them and remind them that it's not a math question. Other questions might involve a bit of probability. It might be stuff that a candidate would surely know, e.g., to pick between 5 options, pick a random number between 1 and 5. But simply the fact that it involves probability will intimidate candidates. Be careful asking questions that sound intimidating. Remember that this is already a really intimidating situation for candidates. Adding an honest, quote-unquote scary, question might just fluster a candidate and cause him to underperform. If you're going to ask a question that sounds quote-unquote scary, make sure you really reassure candidates that it doesn't require the knowledge that they think it does. Offer positive reinforcement. Some interviewers put so much focus on the quote-unquote right question that they forget to think about their own behavior. Many candidates are intimidated by interviewing and try to read into the interviewer's every word. They can cling to each thing that might possibly sound positive or negative. They interpret that little comment of good luck to mean something, even though you say it to everyone, regardless of performance. You want candidates to feel good about the experience, about you, and about their performance. You want them to feel comfortable. A candidate who is nervous will perform poorly, and it doesn't mean that they aren't good. Moreover, a good candidate who has a negative reaction to you or to the company is less likely to accept an offer, and they might dissuade their friends from interviewing / accepting as well. Try to be warm and friendly to candidates. This is easier for some people than others, but do your best. Even if being warm and friendly doesn't come naturally to you, you can still make a concerted effort to sprinkle in positive remarks throughout the interview. Right, exactly. Great work. Great point. Good work. Okay, that's a really interesting approach. Perfect. No matter how poorly a candidate is doing, there's always something they got right. Find a way to infuse some positivity into the interview. Probe deeper on behavioral questions. Many candidates are poor at articulating their specific accomplishments. You ask them a question about a challenging situation, and they tell you about a difficult situation their team faced. As far as you can tell, the candidate didn't really do much. Not so fast, though. A candidate might not focus on themselves because they've been trained to celebrate their team's accomplishments and not boast about themselves. This is especially common for people in leadership roles and female candidates. Don't assume that a candidate didn't do much in a situation just because you have trouble understanding what they did. Call out the situation nicely. Ask them specifically if they could tell you what their role was. If it didn't really sound like resolving the situation was difficult, then again, probe deeper. Ask them to go into more details about how they thought about the issue and the different steps they took. Ask them why they took certain actions. Not describing the details of the actions they took makes them a flawed candidate, but not necessarily a flawed employee. Being a good interview candidate is its own skill. After all, that's part of why this book exists, and it's probably not one you want to evaluate. Coach your candidates. Read through the sections on how candidates can develop good algorithms. Many of these tips are ones you can offer to candidates who are struggling. You're not teaching the test when you do this. You're separating interview skills from job skills. Many candidates don't use an example to solve an interview question, or they don't use a good example. This makes it substantially more difficult to develop a solution. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not very good problem solvers. If candidates don't write an example themselves, or if they inadvertently write a special case, guide them. Some candidates take a long time to find the bug because they use an enormous example. This doesn't make them a bad tester or developer. It just means that they didn't realize that it would be more efficient to analyze their code conceptually first, or that a small example would work nearly as well. Guide them. If they dive into code before they have an optimal solution, pull them back and focus them on the algorithm, if that's what you want to see. It's unfair to say that a candidate never found or implemented the optimal solution if they didn't really have the time to do so. If they get nervous and stuck and aren't sure where to go, suggest to them that they walk through the brute force solution to look for areas to optimize. If they haven't said anything and there is a fairly obvious brute force, remind them that they can start off with a brute force. Their first solution doesn't have to be perfect. Even if you think that a candidate's ability in one of these areas is an important factor, it's not the only factor. You can always mark someone down for failing this hurdle while helping to guide them past it. While this book is here to coach candidates through interviews, one of your goals as an interviewer is to remove the effect of not preparing. After all, some candidates have studied for interviews and some candidates haven't, and this probably doesn't reveal much about their skills as an engineer. Guide candidates using the tips in this book. Within reason, of course. You don't want to coach candidates through the problems so much that you're not valuing their problem-solving skills anymore. Be careful here, though. If you're someone who comes off as intimidating to candidates, this coaching could make things worse. It can come off as you telling candidates that they're constantly messing up by creating bad examples, not prioritizing testing the right way, and so on. If they want silence, give them silence. One of the most common questions that candidates ask me is how to deal with an interviewer who insists on talking when they just need a moment to think in silence. If your candidate needs this, give your candidate this time to think. Learn to distinguish between I'm stuck and have no idea what to do and I'm thinking in silence. It might help you to guide your candidate, and it might help many candidates, but it doesn't necessarily help all candidates. Some need a moment to think. Give them that time, and take into account when you're evaluating them that they got a bit less guidance than others. Know your mode: sanity check, quality, specialist, and proxy. At a very, very high level, there are 4 modes of questions. Sanity check. These are often easy problem solving or design questions. They assess a minimum degree of competence in problem solving. They won't distinguish between okay versus great, so don't evaluate them as such. You can use them early in the process to filter out the worst candidates, or when you only need a minimum degree of competency. Quality check. These are the more challenging questions, often in problem solving or design. They are designed to be rigorous and really make a candidate think. Use these when algorithmic problem solving skills are of high importance. The biggest mistake people make here is asking questions that are in fact bad problem solving questions. Specialist questions. These questions test knowledge of specific topics such as Java or machine learning. They should be used when for skills a good engineer couldn't quickly learn on the job. These questions need to be appropriate for true specialists. Fortunately, I've seen situations where a company asks a candidate who just completed a 10-week coding bootcamp detailed questions about Java. What does this show? If she has the knowledge, then she only learned it recently and, therefore, is likely to be easily acquirable. If it's easily acquirable, then there's no reason to hire for it. Proxy knowledge. This is knowledge that is not quite at the specialist level. In fact, you might not even need it, but that you would expect a candidate at their level to know. For example, it might not be very important to you if a candidate knows CSS or HTML, but if a candidate has worked in depth with these technologies and can't talk about why tables are or aren't good, that suggests an issue. They're not absorbing information core to their job. When companies get into trouble is when they mix and match these. They ask specialist questions to people who aren't specialists. They hire for specialist roles when they don't need specialists. They need specialists but are only assessing pretty basic skills. They are asking sanity check easy questions, but think they're asking quality check questions. They therefore interpret a strong difference between okay and great performance, even though a very minor detail might have separated these. In fact, having worked with a number of small and large tech companies in the hiring process, I have found that most companies are doing one of these things wrong. Alright, that's it for intro part 3. When I do the next live, I'll be starting from intro part 4 before the interview. Alright, hopefully that helped with the audio problem. Redoing this. Thank you very much for watching. Checking the live maybe. Or just enjoy the on demand. Maybe not more of these. I will see. Bye bye.